A city could starve without a single enemy at its gates. Drought could empty its wells. Siege could seal its walls. Famine could strike even in times of peace, when the harvest failed and no relief arrived. For medieval cities, the ability to store water and food was not a convenience. It was the line between survival and collapse. By the end of this video, you will understand the hidden systems that allowed entire populations to outlast attackers, endure dry seasons, and survive crop failures across Europe and the Middle East. We are talking about granaries built to keep grain cool and dry for years, underground silos that acted like natural refrigerators, massive cisterns that held millions of liters of rainwater, and aqueducts that carried water from distant mountains into city reservoirs. These systems were far more sophisticated than most people assume, and their design reveals a deep understanding of engineering, climate, and human nature. What if the key to surviving tomorrow's disruptions was already invented centuries ago? Drought, siege, and famine formed a triple threat that medieval cities could never ignore. Each one arrived through a different door, but all three led to the same outcome: a city slowly running out of what it needed to survive. Consider drought first. A dry season could shrink rivers to a trickle and drop the water table below the reach of wells. In southern Europe and the Middle East, summer heat often turned streams into dusty beds. If a city had no way to store the rains of winter, it faced months of desperate rationing. In Constantinople, for example, a single dry spell could threaten hundreds of thousands of people. That is why the Byzantine capital relied on an enormous network of cisterns, some hidden beneath the streets, others open to the sky, all designed to hold water through the hottest months. Then came siege. An enemy army could surround a city and cut every road, every path, every river that brought food in. The Arab sieges of Constantinople in the 7th and 8th centuries were massive blockades that lasted for years. The attackers hoped to starve the defenders into surrender. The city survived because its grain stores, its cisterns, and its stockpiles were large enough to outlast the enemy's patience. Without those reserves, the walls alone would have been useless. Finally, famine could strike even in times of peace. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 spread across northern Europe after relentless rain ruined harvests year after year. Crops rotted in the fields, grain prices soared. Communities that had not stored enough surplus watched their people weaken and fall to illness. Historians note that the hardship reshaped how entire regions thought about food security. The lesson was harsh but clear. A city could not rely on next year's harvest. It had to keep a margin for the bad years. These three threats, drought, siege, famine, set the stakes for medieval urban life. A city's survival did not depend only on its soldiers or its walls. It depended on how much grain it had in its granaries, how much water sat in its cisterns, and how well those supplies were protected from rot, pests, and theft. Storage infrastructure mattered as much as any fortress. So what were the core ideas that guided all medieval storage thinking? The principles were surprisingly simple, yet they required deep knowledge of climate, biology, and engineering. And they began with one fundamental truth: everything stored was alive. Grain was still breathing, still releasing heat, still attracting insects. Water was still growing algae, still evaporating, still breeding mosquitoes. The challenge was not just to pile things up. It was to keep them usable for months, sometimes years, under conditions that were often damp, hot, or infested. Three core ideas drove medieval storage systems: surplus, security, and sustainability. Surplus meant storing far more than a city needed for a few weeks. A good harvest could yield enough grain for 2 or even 3 years of normal consumption, but the smart city held onto that extra. Why? Because the next harvest might fail, the next siege might last a full year, or a drought might drain the rivers before spring arrived. In places like Cairo or Constantinople, state granaries were designed to hold enough food to feed the entire population for at least 12 months. That margin was not hoarding. It was insurance against the unpredictable. Security came next. A full granary was a tempting target. The same stores that could save a city could also attract thieves, greedy officials, or an enemy's raiding party. So storage buildings were built with thick stone walls, heavy locked doors, and raised floors that kept grain away from damp ground and hungry rodents. Guards patrolled the roofs. Access was restricted. Some cities even stored their grain in fortified towers or within the walls of a citadel, so that if an enemy broke through the outer defenses, they still could not reach the food. Security also meant protecting against rot and pests. That required constant monitoring, regular rotation of stock, and careful design of ventilation. Sustainability was the third principle, and it may have been the most impressive given the technology of the time. Without refrigeration, how do you keep grain, dried meat, or even water usable for months or years? The answer involved clever use of natural cooling, airflow, and insulation. Grain silos were often built partially underground, where the earth maintained a steady temperature. Some had channels for cool night air to circulate. Others were coated with lime or plaster to reduce moisture and discourage insects. Water cisterns were built deep and shaded, sometimes with multiple chambers so that one could be cleaned while another remained in use. These three principles were not applied in a vacuum. They existed within a constant tension between central control and household independence. Many families kept their own small stocks in a corner of the home or a backyard pit. That gave them a personal buffer, but individual storage could not match the scale or security of a state-run facility. A household might lose its supply to fire or theft. A state granary could protect tons of grain behind stone and guards. The most resilient cities combined both approaches. The state stored the bulk of reserves for emergencies, while households kept enough for daily life and minor shortages. This balance meant that no single failure could bring down the entire system. How these principles translated into actual buildings and infrastructure depended heavily on the region. In the rocky hills of Yemen, communities carved underground silos into solid stone. In the flat river valleys of northern Europe, they built timber-framed granaries on stilts. The climate, the available materials, and the nature of the threat all shaped the final design. And that is what we turn to next, the specific types of storage that emerged from these principles, each one a solution to the same ancient problem of keeping a city fed and watered through the worst of times. A single granary filled with wheat could determine the fate of an entire kingdom. In cities across Europe and the Middle East, colossal stone buildings stood as monuments to foresight, designed not for beauty but for one cold purpose, keeping grain alive. The principles that governed these structures were simple yet unforgiving. Grain is alive in a way that surprises many of us today. It breathes, it releases heat. It draws moisture from the air. If you pile it too deep, the center will heat up and begin to rot. If you leave a crack in the wall, rodents will find it. If the roof leaks, mold will spread through the entire harvest. So the builders of medieval granaries approached their work with the same precision as a fortress architect. The most obvious feature of a serious granary was its elevated floor. The floor did not rest directly on the ground. Instead, it was raised on stone piers or wooden posts, leaving a gap underneath. That gap was not wasted space. It let air circulate beneath the grain, drawing away moisture that could rise from the damp earth. It also made it harder for rats and mice to reach the stores, since they could not simply tunnel up through the floor. In northern Europe, where timber was abundant and rain was a constant companion, granaries were often built on stilts. These raised structures looked like small houses on legs, and they stood in the middle of farmyards or at the edges of villages. The elevation kept the grain dry, and the surrounding air could flow freely beneath the wooden floorboards. In southern and eastern regions, where the legacy of Rome still shaped building habits, granaries took a more massive form. The Horia of the Roman Empire had been stone fortresses of storage, sometimes 3 or 4 stories tall, with walls 2 or 3 feet thick. Medieval builders adapted these designs, constructing multi-story stone granaries that could hold hundreds of tons of grain. The walls were thick not only for insulation but also for security. Thieves would need more than a simple crowbar to break through. The windows were small and high, placed to let in light without letting in rain. Ventilation shafts ran through the walls, sometimes with adjustable slats that could be opened or closed to control the flow of air. On hot days, the cool night air could be trapped inside while the heat of the day was kept out. On damp days, the vents could be sealed to protect the grain from humidity. Inside, the grain was not simply dumped and forgotten. It required regular attention. A pile of wheat or barley generates its own heat as it settles, and that heat can gradually spoil the kernels at the center. So workers would periodically turn the grain, shifting it from one area to another, or even scooping it out and repiling it. This process allowed the heat to escape and exposed any pockets of moisture or insects. In some large granaries, the grain was stored in separate bins, each small enough that the temperature could be managed. The cleaning was just as important. Dust, chaff, and broken kernels could attract pests or become a breeding ground for mold. Workers would sift the grain, removing debris, and sometimes even spread it out on a flat surface to let the wind carry away the lighter bits. This was laborious work, but it could mean the difference between a store that lasted a year and one that rotted in 3 months. A city that took grain storage seriously could withstand a siege for far longer than its enemies expected. The records of medieval Constantinople describe granaries that held enough wheat to feed the population for more than a year. During the long Arab blockades, those stores were the city's secret weapon. The attackers assumed that hunger would force the gates open, but the defenders simply rationed their supplies, turning the siege into a waiting game that the attackers could not win. In times of peace, the same granaries acted as economic stabilizers, releasing grain onto the market when prices rose too high and buying when harvests were plentiful. The system was not perfect. Corruption could drain the stores. A damp season could ruin a year's worth of work, but when it worked, it allowed cities to survive the unthinkable. Still, even the finest stone granary had limits. The grain could only hold its vitality for a certain time before it began to degrade, and the great stone structures were visible targets, vulnerable to fire or intentional destruction. So alongside these massive storehouses, another type of storage emerged, one that was hidden, cool, and almost invisible. Hidden beneath the ground lay another kind of storehouse, one that used the earth itself as insulation. These were the underground pit silos, simple in concept but incredibly effective. Builders dug deep cylindrical pits, sometimes up to 10 or 15 feet deep, and lined the walls with clay, stone, or tightly woven baskets. Once filled with grain, the top was sealed with a thick layer of earth, sometimes packed with straw or clay to block moisture and air. Inside, the temperature stayed cool and stable, far from the heat of summer sun or the chill of winter. More importantly, the seal removed oxygen, which slowed the respiration of the grain and kept pests at bay. A well-constructed silo could preserve grain for years, even decades, if the seal remained unbroken. This technique appeared across medieval Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, adapted to local materials and climates. In Yemen, communities carved these silos into solid rock on hillsides. In the plains of Hungary, they used clay-lined pits near settlements. In Morocco, grain pits were dug in sheltered valleys where the water table was low. Success depended heavily on site selection. A pit dug too close to a river or in low ground would invite moisture, ruining the grain within months. Builders tested the soil, checked drainage, and sometimes lined the base with gravel or charcoal to draw away dampness. The silos offered advantages over above-ground granaries. They were cheaper to build, requiring no stone walls or timber roofs. They were less visible to raiders and could be hidden in forests or fields. But they had weaknesses. They were vulnerable to flooding if the site was poorly chosen, and they could be hard to access in deep snow or mud. Once opened, the grain had to be used quickly because the seal was broken. For that reason, many families and villages combined both methods, using above-ground storehouses for regular access and underground silos for long-term emergency reserves. The largest silos were often built for monastic communities, whose foresight and discipline made them masters of underground storage. But even as these hidden chambers kept grain safe, another form of storage rose above the landscape: the great timber barns of the monasteries and manors, designed to hold the tithes of entire regions. Above ground, the great barns of monasteries and manors dominated the countryside. These were not simple sheds. They were engineered cathedrals of storage, built to hold the wealth of an entire estate under one roof. The finest example still standing today is the Tithe barn at Great Coxwell in England, a stone and timber structure that dates to the late 13th century. Walk inside that barn and you feel the scale immediately. The roof rises high overhead, supported by massive oak beams arranged in what builders call an encircled construction. Rows of thick wooden columns divide the interior into a central nave and two side aisles, much like the layout of a church. The roof itself was originally covered with stone tiles, heavy enough to withstand wind and snow, yet carefully weighted so the timber frame could bear the load. The walls were built of local stone, thick and solid, with narrow slits left open for ventilation. Those slits were not decorative. They allowed a constant flow of air to pass through the barn, carrying away moisture and keeping the grain cool. The floor was raised slightly above the ground on a stone foundation, preventing damp from seeping up into the stored crops. At Great Coxwell, the barn could hold hundreds of tons of wheat, barley, and oats from the surrounding monastic land. That grain was the tithe, a tenth of every harvest that farmers owed to the church. The entire region poured its surplus into that one building. When winter came or when a siege cut off outside food, the barn became the community's lifeline. Monks and estate managers knew exactly how much they had, how long it would last, and how to ration it out. The design was not unique to England. Similar barns appeared across France, Germany, and Italy, each adapted to local materials and climate. In areas where timber was scarce, builders used brick or stone. In wetter regions, they raised the entire barn on a series of stone piers, letting air flow freely underneath. The roof might be thatched with straw or shingled with wooden tiles, depending on what was available. The key features were always the same: a raised floor, good ventilation, and a strong roof that kept rain out and heat in. These barns served as central collection points for agricultural surplus. They allowed a manor or monastery to gather the harvest from dozens of scattered fields into one secure location. From there, the grain could be distributed to the local population, sold at market, or held in reserve for emergencies. The Tithe barn at Great Coxwell, for instance, was part of a Cistercian abbey. The monks were renowned for their disciplined farming and careful management. They understood that a single season of bad weather could undo years of work, so they always kept a margin. The barn was their insurance policy, a visible promise that the community would not starve. Yet even the most impressive barn was only half the solution. A city could fill its granaries with wheat and barley, but without water, those stores would become useless. A person can survive weeks without food, but only days without water. So medieval engineers turned their attention to another kind of storage, one that held not grain but the most precious resource of all. A full granary meant nothing without a single drop of water. A city could store enough wheat to survive 3 sieges, but if its wells ran dry, the gates would open within days. Thirst comes faster than hunger, and it allows no negotiation. That is why every serious medieval city invested heavily in water storage, and the centerpiece of that system was the cistern. A cistern is essentially a man-made reservoir, a pit dug into the ground or carved out of bedrock, sealed to hold water and covered to keep it clean. The basic technology was ancient, but medieval builders refined it to an art. They lined the walls with a special waterproof plaster called hydraulic mortar, a mixture of lime and volcanic ash that could set underwater and remain impermeable for centuries. The floor was paved with stone or brick, sloping slightly to a central basin where sediment could settle. Above ground, a sturdy roof of timber, stone, or brick kept out sunlight, leaves, and animals. Sunlight was the enemy because it encouraged algae to bloom, which would foul the water and make it undrinkable. The roof also slowed evaporation, an essential feature in the hot, dry summers that plagued many regions. In Constantinople, the scale of these cisterns was breathtaking. The city had hundreds of them, some open to the sky, others hidden underground in vast vaulted chambers. The largest open-air cistern, the Cistern of Aetius, measured roughly 250 feet long and held millions of gallons of water. But the most famous is the Basilica Cistern, a subterranean palace of columns and cool, still water that still exists today. It was built in the 6th century under Emperor Justinian, and it could hold 80,000 cubic meters of water. That is enough to fill more than 30 Olympic swimming pools. The Basilica Cistern was supported by a forest of marble columns, each one recycled from earlier Roman buildings, while its brick walls were coated with several layers of waterproof plaster. The roof was a series of brick vaults strong enough to support the weight of the city above. These cisterns were not isolated. They were fed by an intricate network of channels that collected rainwater from every available surface. Roofs of houses, churches, and palaces were fitted with clay tiles that channeled rain into downspouts made of terracotta or lead. Those downspouts emptied into stone drains in the courtyards or streets, and those drains sloped gently toward the nearest cistern. Gutters ran along the edges of public squares, guiding runoff into underground pipes. Even the paved streets themselves were designed with a slight crown in the middle so that water flowed to the sides where it could be captured. In many cities, every drop was accounted for. The system was not just practical. It was a matter of law in some places. Regulations required property owners to maintain their gutters and keep their cisterns clean. Officials inspected the channels to ensure they were not blocked by debris or deliberately tampered with. During a siege, these inspections became urgent. A blocked gutter could mean a dry cistern, and a dry cistern could mean surrender. The sophisticated rainwater harvesting of Constantinople and other cities shows that medieval people understood hydrology far better than we often give them credit for. They knew that water could be stored against the dry months, that it needed protection from contamination, and that the effort of building and maintaining these systems was a small price to pay for survival. Yet even the largest cistern had limits. It depended entirely on rainfall, and a dry winter could leave the reservoir dangerously low, so the most ambitious cities did not rely on rainwater alone. They reached beyond their walls into the hills and mountains, where springs and rivers provided a more dependable source. That is where the aqueducts came in, carrying water across miles of open country, over valleys and through tunnels, straight into the heart of the city. Aqueducts turned distant springs into city lifelines. The principle was simple but transformative. Water flows downhill, so if you built a channel with a gentle, constant slope, you could carry water from a mountain spring all the way to a city reservoir, sometimes over dozens of miles. The Romans had mastered this art, and many medieval cities inherited their aqueducts, repairing them when they cracked or silted up, and sometimes extending them to reach new sources. Constantinople relied on one of the longest aqueduct systems of the ancient world, a network that stretched more than 150 miles from the forests of Thrace. The most famous branch was the Aqueduct of Valens, a towering two-tiered structure that strode across the valleys on stone arches, some still standing today. Water traveled through a covered channel on top of those arches, protected from evaporation and contamination. The channel was lined with waterproof mortar, and at intervals, settling tanks allowed sand and debris to sink to the bottom before the water continued on its way. Maintaining that flow was a constant challenge. A single crack could lose a significant portion of the water. Tree roots could break through the mortar. Earthquakes could shift the alignment, and without constant slope, the water would pool and stagnate. Teams of workers walked the length of the aqueduct regularly, patching leaks, clearing blockages, and making sure the gradient remained true. In some places, the aqueduct ran underground through tunnels cut into solid rock, emerging only to cross a valley on a bridge of arches. Those tunnels required ventilation shafts and access points for repairs. The whole system was a living, breathing piece of infrastructure, demanding attention every season. When the aqueducts worked, they delivered a steady, reliable flow of water into the city's distribution points, filling the cisterns that we discussed earlier. But even the Aqueduct of Valens was not the end point of the story. The water it carried eventually reached the most famous water storage network of the medieval world, a network that still inspires awe in everyone who walks through it. Constantinople's storage network was a masterpiece of foresight. The city sat on a peninsula, surrounded by water on three sides, yet its survival depended on capturing every drop of rain that fell. Hundreds of cisterns dotted the urban landscape, some open to the sky like shallow lakes, others hidden beneath the streets in vast underground chambers. The Basilica Cistern, built in the 6th century, could hold 80,000 cubic meters of water. Its roof was supported by a forest of marble columns, many recycled from earlier Roman buildings, and its walls were coated with layers of waterproof plaster. A second great cistern, known as Byzantine, was almost as large, with 324 columns arranged in neat rows. Together, these two facilities alone could supply the city for months. But they were just the most famous parts of a system that included dozens of smaller cisterns, scattered through every neighborhood beneath churches, palaces, and even private homes. Each cistern was fed by a combination of rainwater and the long aqueduct we mentioned earlier. The Valens aqueduct brought water from distant hills, but it did not fill every reservoir directly. Instead, the water entered a series of distribution channels, branching out like veins through the city. Some branches ended at public fountains where citizens could fill their jars. Others led to the cisterns, topping them off during the wet months so they could carry the city through the dry ones. The whole network was managed by a dedicated office, the Water Commission, which employed engineers, inspectors, and repair crews. They kept records of flow rates, checked for leaks, and enforced strict rules about cleanliness. During a siege, this system became the city's quietest defender. The Arab fleets and armies that surrounded Constantinople in the 7th and 8th centuries expected thirst to break the defenders. They watched the sea, but they could not see the cisterns hidden beneath the ground. The city waited them out, drawing water stored years earlier, and the attackers eventually withdrew. Grain was stored just as carefully. The imperial warehouses, known as the Horia, were built along the Golden Horn, the city's great harbor. Massive underground magazines, cut into the bedrock, held row after row of amphorae and sacks of wheat. The grain was rotated regularly, with older supplies sent to the bakeries first, while fresh harvests filled the spaces. The same principles applied: raised floors, ventilation shafts, and tight seals against moisture and pests. Yet even this elaborate system had limits. Water and grain could be stored for months, sometimes years, but other foods needed different treatment. Meat, fish, fruits, and vegetables spoiled much faster. So alongside the cisterns and granaries, medieval cities developed a parallel set of techniques to preserve these perishable staples. The ability to store diversity in diet was just as vital as storing the basics, and that is what we turn to next. Preserving meat and fish demanded entirely different thinking. Grain could be dried and stored in bulk, but animal protein spoiled far faster. A slaughtered cow would rot within days in summer heat unless something was done quickly. So medieval communities developed a toolkit of techniques that worked with nature rather than against it, turning perishable flesh into long-lasting stores that could feed a city through winter or siege. The most widespread method was salting. Salt draws moisture out of cells through osmosis, and without moisture, the bacteria that cause decay cannot survive. Butchers would cut meat into strips or slabs, rub them thoroughly with coarse salt, and then layer them in barrels or clay pots with more salt between each piece. Some recipes called for a brine soak first, a concentrated saltwater solution that penetrated deep into the tissue. After salting, the meat was often left to dry in the open air, hung in a cool, shaded place where breezes could carry moisture away. The result was a product that could last months, though it needed to be soaked in fresh water before cooking to remove some of the salt. Smoking added another layer of protection. Hanging meat or fish over a slow fire of hardwood or peat exposed it to chemicals in the smoke that discouraged mold and insects while also sealing the surface with a protective layer of tar-like compounds. The smoke also imparted flavor, which made the preserved food more palatable than plain salted meat. In Northern Europe, fish was especially important. The Norse tradition of drying cod in the cold, dry air of winter created stockfish, a product so light and durable that it could be stored for years without any salt at all. The fish was split, gutted, and hung on wooden racks or even on the bare rocks of the coastline. The wind and cold did the work, removing moisture so completely that the fish became as hard as wood. When needed, it could be pounded with a mallet or soaked in water to soften it. In the Mediterranean, the same principle applied to fish, but the climate demanded different methods. There, fish were often salted in barrels or packed in layers of salt, and then pressed to remove liquid. Tuna and anchovies were common catches, and their flesh could be preserved for months with careful handling. Olives were another staple preserved in brine, a simple saltwater solution that drew out bitterness and kept the fruit edible for the entire year. Olive oil itself served as a preservative for other foods. Cheeses were sometimes submerged in oil to seal them from air, and jars of cooked vegetables could be stored under a layer of rendered fat. Pork was a favorite for this technique. After boiling or roasting, chunks of meat were packed tightly into clay pots or wooden barrels and covered with molten lard or clarified butter. Once the fat cooled and solidified, it formed an airtight seal that kept out bacteria and mold. In some regions, honey served the same purpose. Honey is naturally antibacterial because of its low moisture content and high acidity. Fruits, nuts, and even small pieces of meat were preserved by being completely coated or submerged in honey, which prevented spoilage while adding sweetness. Fermentation was yet another powerful tool, and it had the added benefit of preserving essential vitamins. Cabbage turned into sauerkraut kept for months in barrels, providing vitamin C that could prevent scurvy during long winters or extended sieges. Pickling vegetables in vinegar or brine did the same for cucumbers, carrots, and turnips. These fermented foods were not just survival rations. They were a deliberate strategy to keep a defender's strength up when fresh greens were impossible to find. A city with a cellar full of pickled vegetables, salted fish, smoked hams, and sealed jars of fruit in honey could feed its people a balanced diet even when the fields were empty. That variety mattered. Malnutrition weakened immune systems and made disease more likely. A population that ate only grain and water would slowly decline, but one with access to preserved meat, fish, and vegetables could hold out far longer. The storage of these foods required their own dedicated spaces, cellars dug beneath houses or in the cool shade of monastery grounds stayed at a steady temperature through the seasons. Barrels were stacked on their sides with the bunghole facing upward to allow for sampling and refilling. Clay pots were sealed with wax or resin and buried in the earth floor to keep them stable. Every available corner was used, every method tested by generations of experience. But even the best-stocked larder was useless without a steady source of water, which is why medieval cities also turned to the ground beneath their feet. Beneath every great city lay a secret that no enemy could see, a hidden network of shafts plunging deep into the earth to tap the water table itself. A well did not wait for rain. It did not rely on distant aqueducts. It reached straight down into the dark where groundwater sat year after year, independent of the seasons above. The construction of a medieval well was an act of patient determination. Digging a shaft through loose soil was dangerous enough, but when the diggers hit bedrock, the real work began. They would light fires to heat the rock, then pour cold water to crack it, chipping away piece by piece until the shaft descended far enough to reach the water-bearing layer. The sides had to be supported immediately to prevent collapse. Stone or brick lining was built up from the bottom as the shaft advanced, locking the walls in place and preventing the surrounding earth from sliding in. The lining also kept surface water from seeping down and contaminating the supply. At the top, a stone curb or a heavy timber frame formed the wellhead, and above that sat the windlass, a wooden roller with a crank and a rope or chain. A bucket would be lowered, filled, and hauled back up by hand, sometimes aided by a counterweight or even a horse-powered mechanism in the largest installations. The depth of these wells varied enormously. In low-lying areas, the water table might be only a few meters down, but in the chalk hills of southern England or the limestone of the Alps, diggers could descend 30, 40, even 60 meters before reaching water. One of the most famous examples is the well at Dover Castle, which plunges over 60 meters into the chalk bedrock. That well was the castle's lifeline during sieges. While the garrison above held the walls, the well below kept them alive. Without it, no amount of stored grain could have saved them from thirst. Urban wells followed the same basic design but on a communal scale. In many medieval towns, the main well was located in the central square or marketplace, accessible to all residents. It was a social hub where neighbors gathered to fill their buckets and exchange news. The well was often covered with a roof or a small building to keep debris out, and the local authorities appointed a well keeper responsible for maintaining the ropes and buckets and for ensuring no one polluted the water. But wells had weaknesses that no amount of careful construction could eliminate. The most obvious was drought. If the water table dropped during a dry season, the well could go dry. A shallow well might fail after just a few weeks without rain, and even a deep well could run low if the aquifer was not recharged. Communities that relied solely on wells often faced desperate shortages in late summer. That is why most cities combined wells with cisterns, using the cisterns to capture rainwater and the wells as a backup or supplementary source. During a siege, wells were a prime target. An enemy could try to poison the water by dumping carcasses, rotting vegetation, or chemicals into the shaft. Defenders took precautions, covering the well with a heavy lid and posting guards. Some castles built their wells inside the inner keep, as far from the walls as possible, to make tampering harder. Even so, a determined attacker could sometimes divert a well's recharge by tunneling into the water table from outside the walls, drawing the water away before it reached the castle. The constant threat of contamination, depletion, or sabotage forced cities to diversify their water sources. A single point of failure could mean thirst for thousands. so the smartest urban planners combined wells with cisterns, and when geography allowed, they also reached for rivers and canals. Rivers offered a far greater volume of water than any well or cistern could hold, but they brought their own risks. They could be blocked, diverted, or polluted by an upstream enemy. They could flood in spring and shrink to a trickle in summer, and they flowed only where nature placed them, which was not always where a city stood. So engineers learned to bend rivers, digging canals that carried water directly into the city's heart, storing it in basins and reservoirs that gave the population a steady, controllable supply. Rivers were a city's greatest asset and its most exposed nerve. The same flow that turned mill wheels and filled drinking vessels could be cut, polluted, or blocked by an enemy upstream. A medieval city that relied solely on a river for its water supply was one fishing net away from disaster. That is why the most clever urban planners turned rivers into controlled systems, using weirs, gates, and canals to tame the flow and store it in reservoirs that could outlast any disruption. Paris offers the most vivid example. The Seine ran through the city's heart, carrying barges loaded with grain from the fertile fields of the Beauce region, barrels of wine from Burgundy, and timber from the forests of the north. The river was the main artery of the city's supply, but Paris did not simply dip its buckets into the current. Engineers built a series of waterworks along the Seine, including the famous Samaritain pump, which lifted water from the river and distributed it through lead pipes to public fountains and private mansions. The water was not used directly from the river in most cases. Instead, it was directed into settling basins where sediment could sink to the bottom, then into stone reservoirs where it was held for distribution. This system gave Paris a more reliable and cleaner supply than simply collecting from the river's edge. The same principle applied to the city's defenses. Moats, those deep, wide trenches that surrounded city walls, were not just obstacles for attackers. They were also reservoirs. When a siege began, defenders would open sluice gates to let river water flow into the moat, turning it into a water barrier that protected the base of the walls. The moat also provided a ready supply for fighting fires, which were a constant threat during bombardments. Weirs, low dams built across rivers, helped control the water level and diverted part of the flow into channels that fed these moats and reservoirs. Gates and locks allowed engineers to adjust the flow, releasing only what was needed and storing the rest. The river itself was also the highway for grain shipment. Flat-bottomed barges called gabars floated down the Seine from the grain-producing regions, unloading at the ports along the city's edge. The grain was then carried directly into the granaries we talked about earlier. This transport system was incredibly efficient, but it had a glaring weakness. A besieging army could easily block the river, stopping the supplies from reaching the city. In the 100 Years' War, English forces stationed at points along the Seine could intercept entire convoys, starving Paris even when the granaries inside the city were still half full. That is why cities that depended on rivers also built large emergency stores and supplemented with wells and cisterns. The vulnerability of rivers forced medieval engineers to think regionally. In the dry landscapes of the Middle East, where rivers were seasonal and unreliable, every drop of rain was captured and stored in vast underground chambers. In the wetter climate of Northern Europe, where rivers flowed year-round, the challenge was more about controlling excess water and preventing flooding. These different climates produced different storage traditions. The stone-vaulted cisterns of Constantinople and the timber-framed granaries of England were both solutions to the same problem, but they were shaped by the worlds around them. And that leads directly into the regional adaptations that defined how every city, from the Mediterranean to the Baltic, prepared for the worst. Along the Mediterranean coast, water was the constant worry. The summers were long and dry. Winters brought rain in short, intense bursts, and the challenge was to capture every drop before it ran into the sea or evaporated under the sun. So the people of that region became masters of collection and storage, building cisterns that could hold the winter bounty through the parched months. In the hills above cities like Palermo and Valencia, entire networks of stone-lined pits caught runoff from roofs and paved courtyards. The water then traveled through terracotta pipes into underground chambers, sometimes dozens of them linked together like a hidden lake beneath the streets. But the most impressive adaptation was not a cistern at all. It was a tunnel, the Qanat, a Persian invention that spread across North Africa, Spain, and even into Sicily, was an underground channel that carried water from a distant aquifer directly into a city. Workers dug a gently sloping tunnel, sometimes miles long, from the water source down to the settlement. Vertical shafts at regular intervals allowed them to remove debris and let air circulate. The water inside the tunnel stayed cool and clean, protected from evaporation and contamination. In medieval Persia, cities like Yazd and Kashan depended on these Qanats for their very existence. Without them, the desert would have swallowed every settlement. Further north, the challenge flipped entirely. In the damp climates of Ireland, England, and Scandinavia, water was abundant but could destroy stored grain within weeks. The enemy was not drought but dampness. A single wet season could rot an entire harvest if the grain was not kept dry. So farmers and communities adapted by building raised barns. The cruck-framed barns of medieval England were a direct response to this threat. Cruck frames used long curved timbers that rose from the ground and met at the ridge, forming a high, open interior. The grain was stored on upper floors or in lofts, lifted well above the earth where moisture could seep up through the floor. Many barns had stone or brick foundations with ventilation gaps, allowing air to flow freely beneath the stored crops. In Ireland, the Clachan was a communal settlement where families lived in clusters and shared storage structures. Their grain was often kept in raised stone or wooden horios, similar to the granaries of northern Spain, standing on pillars with a gap underneath to keep out damp and rodents. Drying kilns became essential in these regions, small buildings with a fire pit at one end and a raised platform at the other allowed farmers to dry grain artificially when the weather refused to cooperate. The heat from the fire passed under the grain, driving out moisture before it could cause mold. These kilns were used not only for grain but also for malt, the basis of beer, which was itself a way to preserve the nutrients of barley. In the Middle East, where the landscape ranged from fertile river valleys to arid deserts, storage combined the best of both worlds. Underground silos dug into the desert floor kept grain cool and safe from the heat above. The silos were often lined with straw and sealed with clay, creating a near-airtight environment that slowed spoilage. The same Qanats that brought water also kept the surrounding soil moist enough to support crops, but the grain itself was stored away from that moisture. The regional expertise that emerged from these diverse climates was not accidental. It was the result of generations of trial, error, and observation. A family in the mountains of Yemen learned that their stone-lined underground granaries could preserve grain for years because the dry air and stable temperature worked like a natural refrigerator. A farmer in the English Midlands knew to avoid building his barn in a low spot where fog gathered at night. These small decisions, multiplied across entire regions, created systems that were perfectly tuned to the local environment. And when a drought, siege, or famine struck, that tuning made the difference between a city that weathered the storm and one that fell. The patterns of survival were written not in grand designs alone, but in the intimate knowledge of place. Every region wrote its own chapter in the story of storage, and the next chapter shows how rulers and institutions learned to coordinate these local solutions into something larger. No city could rely on goodwill alone to fill its granaries. The most forward-thinking communities understood that individual effort had to be coordinated by law. or the whole system would collapse at the first sign of trouble. That is why many medieval cities passed ordinances that did something remarkable. They required every household to store a certain amount of grain against future shortages. These were not suggestions or gentle recommendations. They were enforceable rules backed by fines, inspections, and public record. A family living in a walled town might be told to keep enough wheat or barley to feed themselves for 3 months, sometimes 6. The amount depended on the size of the household, and officials could enter private homes to verify what was in the larder. In some places, households were also required to keep a barrel of salted meat or fish, a supply of dried beans, and a small store of cooking oil or fat. The idea was simple. If every family held its own reserve, the city as a whole would be far more resilient. A sudden siege or a failed harvest would not trigger immediate panic because each home had a cushion to fall back on. These private stores were the first line of defense, but the second line was far larger and far more visible: the public granaries administered by city councils. These were the institutions that turned household-level preparedness into a community-wide safety net. City councils would use tax revenue or special levies to buy grain during the harvest season, when prices were lowest. They stored that grain in massive municipal warehouses, often built alongside the city hall or within the strongest section of the wall. Then, during a scarcity or a siege, they released that grain at controlled prices, sometimes giving it away free to the poorest families. The goal was not to make a profit. The goal was to stabilize the market and prevent price gouging from driving the poor into starvation. The most famous example of this system at work was in Florence. The Florentine communal granaries, known as the Ufficio dell'Abbondanza, the Office of Abundance, were a sophisticated public trust. The city employed agents who traveled into the surrounding countryside during the harvest, negotiating with farmers and purchasing wheat at a fair but fixed price. The grain was then brought into the city and stored in stone warehouses near the Arno River. When winter came or when war disrupted trade, the council would open the granaries and sell the grain at a loss if necessary. The records show that Florence sometimes subsidized bread prices for years at a time, using the stored surplus to keep the population fed and calm. In London, the system worked differently but achieved a similar end. The corn markets of medieval London were tightly regulated. All grain brought into the city had to be sold at designated markets, where city officials oversaw the transactions and set maximum prices. The city also maintained its own storehouses, called the city granaries, which were replenished each year from the surrounding counties of Kent, Essex, and Surrey. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, these public stores were the only reason London did not descend into chaos. The council opened the granaries and distributed grain at a fraction of the market price, keeping thousands from starvation while private merchants hoarded what they had at inflated rates. These regulations did not stop at the city gates. They extended into the neighborhoods where local officials were responsible for inspecting private stores. In Paris, each street had a designated warden who would visit homes and confirm that the required reserves were in place. If a family was found lacking, they were given a deadline to purchase more. If they failed again, they could be fined or even evicted from the city during a crisis. The logic was harsh but clear. A household that could not or would not store its share was a danger to everyone else. These inspections also served a practical purpose. Officials could identify families who were genuinely too poor to stockpile and arrange for them to receive grain from the public stores before the crisis worsened. The system was not punitive in spirit. It was a recognition that preparedness required collective discipline. Everyone had a role, and everyone had to be held accountable. Yet even the most disciplined city could not always rely on its own population. There were times when the need was too great, when the harvest failed across an entire region, or when a siege lasted longer than any reserve could cover. In those moments, the city turned to its most reliable institutional partners, the monasteries. Monasteries had been storing food and water for centuries before city councils began their own programs. The monastic tradition of self-sufficiency meant that every abbey maintained its own granaries, cellars, and cisterns, often larger and better managed than anything a city could build. When a secular government ran out of capacity, it could appeal to the nearest monastery for aid. The monks would open their stores and distribute grain, wine, and preserved foods to the surrounding community. In many regions, monasteries acted as the de facto emergency storage nodes for entire provinces. The Abbey of Cluny in Burgundy held enough provisions to feed hundreds of travelers and local poor every year. The Cistercian abbeys of England were known for their vast barns, which doubled as regional relief centers during famines. This relationship between monastic and civic storage was not always harmonious. There were disputes over tithes, over who had the right to control surplus, over whether the church should be taxed to fill the city's granaries. But in the worst moments, those disputes were set aside. A shared understanding prevailed that the grain in the abbey barn was not for the monks alone. It was for the community, and the community would not be allowed to starve while the granaries stood full. That mixture of legal mandate, civic duty, and institutional charity kept medieval cities alive through crises that would have destroyed less prepared societies. And it points toward something even deeper. The idea that storage was not just about structures but about trust, about the willingness of a community to plan together for a future no one could predict. The most reliable storehouses were not built by city councils. They were built by monks. Monasteries held something that no secular government could easily match: stable landholdings passed down through generations, and a disciplined workforce that never stopped working. While a city council had to negotiate with merchants and haggle over prices, an abbey simply grew its own food on its own fields, year after year, decade after decade. The result was a surplus that often dwarfed anything a municipal granary could hold. The Abbey of Cluny in Burgundy owned estates scattered across France, each one sending a portion of its harvest to the central storehouses. The abbey's granaries were vast, stone-built chambers that could hold enough wheat to feed the entire community of monks plus hundreds of dependents and guests for several years. The cellars beneath the abbey were equally impressive, filled with barrels of wine, salted pork, dried fish, and wheels of cheese aging on wooden shelves. The monastery of St. Gall in what is now Switzerland kept detailed records of its stores, listing not only grain but also beans, lentils, dried fruit, honey, and even spices imported from distant markets. These records show that the monks thought about food security in terms of years, not months. They knew that a single bad harvest could plunge a region into hardship, and they prepared accordingly. Their discipline extended to preservation techniques that went far beyond simple drying. The monks at St. Gall were known for brewing beer on a large scale, not just for their own consumption, but because beer was safer to drink than untreated water. The boiling process killed harmful microbes, and the alcohol content kept the beverage from spoiling quickly. In times of siege or epidemic, the monastery's brewery became a vital source of clean drinking water for the surrounding community. Cheese making was another monastic specialty. Hard cheeses like Gruyere and Emmental could be stored for months in cool cellars, providing a concentrated source of protein and fat that traveled well. The monks developed recipes that used rennet and salt to extract moisture, then aged the wheels in caves or stone rooms where humidity and temperature were carefully controlled. These cheeses were not just for the monastery's own larder. They were traded, gifted, and distributed to the poor. During the famines that struck Europe every few decades, the abbey granaries and cellars became the last refuge. When private grain stores ran out and city councils had exhausted their own reserves, people turned to the monasteries. In some cases, the monks opened their doors without hesitation, feeding hundreds or even thousands of desperate families. The Abbey of Cluny, for instance, was known for its daily distribution of bread and soup to the poor, a practice that continued for centuries, but not every monastery shared willingly. There are records of tensions flaring between townspeople and abbots who refused to release stores, insisting that the grain was needed for the monastic community alone. In 1317, during the height of the Great Famine, some monasteries in northern France were attacked by hungry crowds who broke down the doors of the granaries and carried off the grain by force. The church condemned these acts, but the desperation of the people told a different story. The stores were there. The question was who had the right to use them. Monasteries that resisted sharing often did so out of fear for their own survival. If they gave away everything, they would starve when the next crisis came. But the perception of hoarding created lasting resentment. In some towns, the tension never fully healed. Still, the overwhelming pattern was one of generosity. The monastic tradition of hospitality required that any traveler or needy person be offered food and shelter. That rule was not a suggestion, it was a sacred duty. And it meant that the abbey stores were not just for the monks, they were for anyone who arrived at the gate in need. This made monasteries the most resilient emergency storage nodes in the medieval world. They combined enormous physical capacity with a moral obligation to share. Yet even the most generous monastery could not protect its stores without walls, guards, and careful management. A full granary attracted attention, not just from the hungry but also from thieves and enemies. The next step in the story is how those stores were defended, how the very structures that housed the food became fortresses in their own right. A locked door and a single key could determine whether a city survived its darkest months. The grain that filled a granary was not just food, it was power, and power attracted both thieves and desperate crowds. So every serious medieval city developed a layer of security around its stores that went far beyond thick walls. The first line of defense was the key itself. Large granaries had only one or two keys, held by a trusted official who was personally accountable for the contents. In Venice, that official was the head of the Camera del Frumento, the office of wheat, which managed the city's entire grain supply. He kept the key on his person at all times. When grain needed to be released, a committee of inspectors would gather, record the amount, and witness the transaction. Every opening was logged. Every jar, sack, and barrel was counted at regular intervals. These inventories were not casual checklists. They were detailed records that could be audited by the city council. If a shortage appeared, the official was expected to explain where the grain had gone. If he could not, he faced severe penalties, including confiscation of his property or even banishment. This system was designed to prevent the quiet pilfering that could drain a city's reserves long before any enemy arrived. But the greatest threat came not from a single dishonest official, but from the chaos of a siege or famine. When food became scarce, the price of grain could skyrocket overnight. Merchants who had stored their own supplies would hoard them, waiting for prices to climb even higher. Meanwhile, the poorest families had no reserves of their own. They relied on daily wages to buy bread, and when bread became too expensive, they had nothing. That is when the city's system of rationing or public sale became essential. The Venetian Camera del Frumento did not just store grain. It also bought it in bulk from distant markets during peaceful times and sold it to the public at a fixed, affordable price during emergencies. The office maintained a network of bakeries that produced government-subsidized bread, distributed to registered citizens through a system of tokens or ration cards. Anyone caught selling their ration on the black market could be fined or banned from the program. The goal was to ensure that every mouth received a fair share, regardless of wealth. This was not generosity, it was survival. A city where the rich ate while the poor starved would not stay peaceful for long. social unrest could tear a community apart faster than any siege. When the hungry gathered at the gates of a granary, the officials faced a terrible choice: open the stores and risk running out too soon, or keep them locked and risk a riot that could destroy everything. Armed guards were posted at the doors of major granaries during sieges, not just to repel enemy raiders but to keep order among the citizenry. In Constantinople, the imperial warehouses were protected by soldiers who had orders to use force if necessary. The threat was real. In 1317, during the Great Famine, a crowd in the city of Ypres broke into a municipal granary and carried away the grain by force. The council's authority collapsed. The stores meant to last the winter were consumed in days. The city never fully recovered. That lesson echoed across Europe. Fair distribution was not a kindness, it was a strategic necessity. A city that managed its stores with transparency and fairness could hold together through the worst of times. A city that failed, whether through corruption, hoarding, or simple mismanagement, risked tearing itself apart from within. And that is exactly what happened in one famous siege, where the careful balance between security and distribution broke down, and the consequences shaped the fate of an entire kingdom. In the autumn of 885, the city of Paris faced a test that would reveal everything about the power and the limits of preparation. A massive Viking fleet, hundreds of ships carrying thousands of warriors, sailed up the Seine and surrounded the city. The Parisians had known the threat was coming. For months, they had watched from their walls as the Viking raiders grew bolder, burning villages and monasteries along the river. Their leader, Count Odo, was a man who understood that walls alone would not save them. He had spent the previous year filling the city's granaries and cisterns with every grain and drop of water the surrounding countryside could spare. When the enemy finally arrived, Paris was ready to endure. The city sat on an island in the middle of the Seine, the Isle de la Cité. That location was a double blessing. The river formed a natural moat on all sides, forcing the Vikings to attack over narrow bridges that the defenders could easily block. But just as important, the island gave Paris direct access to the river itself for water. While a city built on high ground might have relied entirely on stored rainwater, Paris could draw from the Seine as long as the enemy did not block the channels or foul the water with debris. The defenders dug shallow wells that tapped directly into the river's flow through the gravel beneath the island. They also reinforced the stone cisterns that sat beneath the cathedral and the royal palace, holding reserves that could be used if the river was temporarily contaminated. Inside the walls, the granaries were packed. Odo had ordered every household to bring a portion of their harvest to the public storehouses. The city's main granary, a stone building near the western bridge, held enough wheat and barley to feed the population for more than a year. Rye and oats were stored in smaller quantities, along with dried beans, salted pork, and barrels of fish preserved in brine. The monks from the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, located just outside the walls, had sent their own surplus into the city before the siege began, knowing that they could not hold out on their own. The grain was stacked in sacks and lined in rows, each one recorded by a scribe who kept a running tally of how many days of rations remained. The Vikings tried every tactic they could think of. They built siege towers and tried to storm the bridges. They launched burning boats against the wooden piles that supported the city's walls. They even tried to dig a tunnel under the river to drain the moat. But every attack was met with fierce resistance. The Parisians had not only stored food, they had also stockpiled stones, arrows, and boiling oil on the walls. The siege dragged on through the autumn and into the winter. The Seine froze over, and the Vikings used the ice to approach the city from new directions. But the granaries stayed full, the cisterns remained deep, the defenders grew tired but never hungry. Months passed. The spring thaw brought fresh hope, but also new Viking reinforcements. By the summer of 886, nearly a year into the siege, the situation had shifted. The the stored grain was still sufficient, but the defenders were exhausted. The constant fighting, the sleepless nights, the slow erosion of morale from living under siege began to take a toll. Odo knew that the city could hold out a few more months, but not indefinitely. The real limit was not the food, it was the human spirit. He made a desperate gamble. He slipped out of the city under cover of darkness, crossed the river in a small boat, and rowed to seek help from the Emperor Charles the Fat. The Emperor eventually arrived with an army, but his solution was deeply disappointing. Instead of fighting the Vikings, he paid them a large sum of silver to leave. The siege ended, but the Parisians felt betrayed. They had endured a year of hardship, and their own leader had been forced to beg for relief because no amount of stored grain could replace the need for reinforcements from outside. The Siege of Paris stands as a powerful example of both the strength and the weakness of pre-siege storage. The Granaries and Cisterns bought the city nearly a year of survival, a remarkable achievement that allowed the defenders to outlast the first onslaught and hope for rescue. But the limits were real. Storage could delay the worst, but it could not defeat an enemy who was determined to wait. The human cost, the exhaustion, the erosion of will, these were factors that no amount of wheat or water could fix. And when the relief finally came, it came in the form of a payment, not a victory, a bitter reminder that even the best prepared city could not always control its own fate. That tension between the power of stored resources and the fragility of the human condition surfaces again and again in the history of medieval sieges. And it points toward a darker question: what happened when the storage systems failed entirely? But what happens when the storehouses stand empty? The Siege of Paris showed how far a prepared city could stretch its reserves, but not every city was so fortunate. Across the medieval world, there are stories of communities that fell not because their walls were weak, but because their granaries ran dry. These failures were rarely sudden. They crept in through a dozen small cracks: poor planning, corruption, pestilence, or simply bad luck. The First Crusade's capture of Jerusalem in the summer of 1099 provides a stark example. The city's defenders, the Fatimid garrison, had stored supplies for a siege, but they underestimated how long the Crusaders would be willing to wait. The Crusaders themselves were running out of food and water, yet they pressed the attack with desperation. Inside Jerusalem, the defenders' stores of grain and water had been carefully rationed for weeks, but the combination of a long blockade and the intense heat of a Palestinian summer drained every reservoir. By the time the Crusaders breached the walls, the defenders were already weakened by thirst and hunger. The stores had been adequate for a short siege, but not for the relentless determination of an enemy who had nothing left to lose. The weakness was not the amount stored, but the assumption that the attackers would give up quickly. That miscalculation proved fatal. A similar lesson emerges from the fall of Constantinople in 1453, though the city's famous storage systems had been in decline for decades. By the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire had shrunk to little more than the city itself. The vast cisterns and granaries that had once held years' worth of supplies were neglected, partially filled with debris, or simply too costly to maintain. The population had dwindled, and the rural lands that once supplied the city were under Ottoman control. When Mehmed II's army surrounded the walls, the defenders had only a fraction of the reserves that had saved the city in earlier centuries. The storerooms were not empty, but they were nowhere near full. The siege lasted only 7 weeks, not because the walls failed, but because the city could no longer sustain a long blockade. The storerooms had been depleted not by a single event, but by a long decline that no last-minute preparation could reverse. Common failure modes appear again and again in medieval history. Corruption among officials who diverted grain for personal profit could quietly drain a city's reserves. Pest infestations, especially rodents or weevils, could destroy stores that were not properly rotated or ventilated. And perhaps most devastating, the deliberate destruction of harvests by an invading army could leave a city with no new food to replenish its granaries. A single enemy raid on the fields outside the walls, timed just before harvest, could ruin an entire year's supply. In such cases, no amount of storage could compensate for a complete lack of future production. These failures were not just tragedies, they were lessons that drove innovation. After Jerusalem, Crusader states built more robust supply lines and fortified storage depots along their routes. After Constantinople, engineers in other cities studied the consequences of neglect and reinforced their own systems. Each collapse taught the next generation what not to do, and the principles that had kept other cities alive for centuries became even more refined. The question that lingered in the minds of every city council, every monastery abbot, and every military commander was simple: how much is enough? And the answer, as we will see next, was never fixed because the threats were always changing. The very systems that had saved cities for centuries began to fade, not because they stopped working, but because the world around them changed. As the medieval period gave way to the early modern era, the old logic of local self-sufficiency gradually weakened, replaced by something larger and more distant. The shift was not sudden. It crept in with the growth of long-distance trade, the rise of national armies, and the slow transformation of economies from local exchange to market-driven capitalism. A city that once relied on its own fields and cisterns started to depend on grain shipped from the Baltic, on water pumped from rivers miles away, on supplies that arrived not by neighborly cart but by merchant convoy. The change made cities more efficient in good times, but it also made them more vulnerable in bad ones. Consider the impact of gunpowder. Cannon changed the nature of siege warfare dramatically. A medieval siege could last years because the high stone walls were difficult to breach. Defenders could wait out attackers behind those walls, relying on their stored food and water. But once gunpowder artillery became common, walls crumbled in weeks, not years. A siege became a short, violent affair decided by firepower, not starvation. The long blockades that had tested city granaries for centuries became rare. Cities no longer needed to store enough food for 2 or 3 years. They needed to withstand a few weeks of intense bombardment, and then either the walls fell or the attackers gave up. The incentive to maintain massive public granaries faded. At the same time, trade networks expanded. The Hanseatic League, a powerful confederation of merchant guilds, moved grain across the Baltic and the North Sea with increasing reliability. A city like Lübeck or Danzig could import wheat from Poland or Prussia and sell it to London or Bruges. The market became a more efficient distributor of food than any local granary could ever be. If a harvest failed in one region, merchants could bring grain from another, provided the roads and ships held. This system worked well for decades, but it created a new dependency. A city that relied on the market had to trust that merchants would keep coming, that wars would not disrupt the shipping lanes, and that prices would stay within reach of ordinary people. That trust was not always rewarded. The rise of national armies also shifted the logic of storage. Medieval lords had often relied on their own local stores to feed their soldiers, but early modern states began building centralized magazines, huge depots that supplied entire armies on campaign. These magazines were managed by the state, not by local communities. They were designed to support troops on the move, not to feed a city's population. The grain that once might have filled a town's granary was now diverted to feed a standing army hundreds of miles away. The state's priorities overrode local needs. In France, the government created a system of military granaries that could provision the king's forces anywhere in the kingdom. The same grain that might have protected a village from famine was now reserved for war. Capitalism played its own role. As markets expanded, grain became a commodity to be traded for profit, not just a necessity to be stored for survival. Merchants bought grain when prices were low and sold when prices were high, often exporting it to distant cities where the return was greatest. This made economic sense on paper, but it left local populations exposed. In years of scarcity, the grain that should have stayed in a region was shipped away because a distant buyer offered a better price. The old ethic of community storage, of keeping a margin for the bad years, was gradually replaced by the logic of the market. The result was that many cities lost their traditional safety net. Yet the medieval storage systems did not vanish overnight. In rural areas, particularly in remote villages in the Alps, the Pyrenees, and the Carpathians, people continued to dig underground silos and build raised granaries well into the 19th century. The old knowledge of how to seal a pit, how to smoke meat, how to ferment vegetables, survived in places where markets did not reach, but in the growing cities those skills faded. A new generation of urban dwellers no longer knew how to judge a well-sealed granary or salt a side of beef. They bought their bread from a baker who bought his flour from a merchant who imported it from a distant port. The connection between a city and its own food supply grew thin. What was lost in that shift was more than just a technique. It was a kind of resilience. A medieval city that stored its own grain and water could survive a siege, a drought, or a bad harvest with relatively little outside help. It had control over its own survival. The early modern city, for all its wealth and sophistication, became dependent on a complex web of trade, transport, and finance. If any one link in that web broke, the entire system could falter. The old local storage was redundant, inefficient, and labor-intensive, but it was also reliable. It did not require the cooperation of foreign markets or the goodwill of long-distance merchants. It required only the discipline of a community that knew its own limits and planned accordingly. That lesson still echoes today. Modern cities rely on global supply chains for food and water, and those chains have proven remarkably resilient through most of recent history. But the medieval example reminds us that dependence is a form of vulnerability. The old systems were built on a simple truth. The best storehouse is the one you can fill with your own hands and protect with your own community. That truth has not disappeared. It has simply been forgotten by most of the world. And as we look toward an uncertain future, perhaps it is worth asking what we might learn from those who had no choice but to plan for the worst and who survived because they did. The medieval granaries and cisterns were built for a world that no longer exists. Yet their logic has never been more relevant. Today, we face a different kind of siege, one whose walls are not made of stone but of climate patterns, supply chains, and global economics. Droughts that once threatened a single valley now stretch across continents. Floods that used to ruin one harvest can now disrupt the production of an entire hemisphere. And the systems we rely on to feed our cities are longer and more fragile than anything a medieval merchant could have imagined. A loaf of bread in a modern supermarket might contain wheat grown in Kansas, milled in Minnesota, baked in a factory in New Jersey, and trucked to a store in New York. That journey depends on fuel, roads, weather, labor, and 100 other factors that can break at any link. When a pandemic, a war, or a natural disaster strains that chain, the results are immediate. Empty shelves, panic buying, price spikes that punish the poorest first. The medieval city had a solution that we have largely abandoned: local storage that was decentralized, redundant, and managed by the community itself. A city that kept grain in multiple granaries, water in dozens of cisterns, and preserved food in hundreds of cellars was not easily starved. A single failure could not bring down the whole system. That is the principle of redundancy, and it is just as effective today as it was 1,000 years ago. In some parts of the world, that lesson is being rediscovered. In sub-Saharan Africa, Non-profit organizations and agricultural researchers have revived the use of underground grain silos, the same pit storage technique that medieval farmers used across the Mediterranean. These silos are cheap to build, require no electricity, and can protect grain from pests and moisture for months. They give smallholder farmers a buffer against drought and market fluctuations. Instead of being forced to sell their harvest immediately at low prices, they can store it and wait for better conditions. The principle is identical to what a medieval village would have done. In water-scarce regions like California and Australia, farmers and cities are turning back to the ancient practice of aquifer storage. They capture winter rains and flood flows and pump them underground into natural reservoirs, exactly the same logic as a cistern, only on a geological scale. The water waits there, hidden beneath the surface, until a dry summer demands its release. It is a system that requires no dams, no sprawling reservoirs that evaporate under the sun, just the quiet storage capacity of the earth itself. The medieval engineers of Constantinople would have recognized the idea immediately. On a personal level, the same thinking applies. Many modern households keep a few days' worth of food in the pantry, but few could survive a month without a trip to the store, let alone a year. The medieval family that stored grain, salted meat, and pickled vegetables in their cellar had a margin that most of us have lost. That margin was not just about survival. It was about peace of mind, the knowledge that a bad season or a temporary disruption would not mean immediate hardship. Building that margin back does not require returning to a pre-industrial lifestyle. It simply means recognizing that a certain degree of local, personal storage is a form of resilience that no app or delivery service can replace. The remnants of these medieval systems still stand in places like the Basilica Cistern in Istanbul and the Tithe barn at Great Coxwell. Tourists walk through them today, marveling at the scale of the engineering, but few pause to consider what they represent. Those stone chambers and underground vaults are not just historical curiosities. They are monuments to a way of thinking that prioritized foresight over convenience, community over isolation, and long-term security over short-term profit. That way of thinking may have been sidelined by the forces of trade and technology, but it has never been entirely extinguished. And as the challenges of our own century become clearer, perhaps the most practical lesson we can take from the medieval city is a simple one. Store what you can close to home and never assume that tomorrow will bring what you need today. The stone chambers that held those supplies still stand in cities across the world. They are no longer filled with grain or water, but they have not been forgotten. The Basilica Cistern in Istanbul, hidden beneath the streets of the old city, draws thousands of visitors each year who walk along raised platforms above the cool, dark water. They gaze at the forest of marble columns, each one recycled from earlier Roman buildings, and listen to the echo of water dripping from the vaulted brick ceiling. What they are experiencing is a direct connection to the medieval mind, a solution to the problem of drought that was built to last. The cistern could hold 80,000 cubic meters of water, enough to supply the great palace and the surrounding neighborhoods through the driest summer. Its walls were coated with multiple layers of hydraulic mortar, a waterproof plaster that set underwater and remained impermeable for centuries. The construction was not rushed. It was planned with the same precision as a cathedral, because the monks and engineers who designed it knew that a single floor could mean thirst for thousands. A few thousand miles to the west, the Tithe barn at Bradford-on-Avon in England tells a different but equally impressive story. This stone building, dating from the early 14th century, was built to store the agricultural tithes owed to the local abbey. Its walls are thick and solid, its roof high and steep, and its floor is raised on a stone foundation to keep the grain dry. The ventilation slits in the walls are narrow but carefully placed to create a cross breeze that carried away moisture and kept the stored crops cool. Inside, the space is vast and open, a single room that could hold hundreds of tons of wheat, barley, and oats. The barn was not just a utility structure. It was a statement of wealth and foresight. The monastic community that built it was saying, in stone and timber, that they could survive any season. Today, the barn is a tourist attraction, a place where visitors can walk through the same space where medieval workers once sifted and turned the grain. It still stands because it was built to endure, not for a decade but for centuries. The same principles appear in the limestone hills of Masada, the ancient fortress overlooking the Dead Sea. Though it predates the medieval period by many centuries, the underground silos carved into the rock at Masada share the same logic that medieval builders would later adopt. These silos were deep, cylindrical pits dug into the bedrock, lined with plaster and sealed with a layer of earth and stone. Inside, the temperature stayed stable, the grain remained dry, and the seal kept out pests and air. The silos at Masada held enough supplies to support the fortress's defenders for years. They are a testament to the idea that storage was not a luxury but a necessity, and that the same basic technique could be adapted across time and geography. Today, the site is an UNESCO World Heritage location, and the silos are among the most striking features for visitors who wonder how a community could survive in such a dry, exposed place. Even more remarkable are the Qanats systems of Iran, underground channels that carried water from aquifers in the mountains to cities and farms across the arid plateau. These tunnels, some stretching for miles, were dug by hand over generations. The water inside them stayed cool and clean, protected from evaporation and contamination. The Qanats required constant maintenance. Workers would descend through vertical shafts to clear blockages and repair the walls. But when they were well maintained, they provided a reliable source of water that could sustain a city for centuries. Many of these Qanats are still in use today, and some have been recognized as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. They show that medieval engineers were not simply copying the past. They were innovating, testing, and refining techniques that had been handed down from earlier civilizations, adapting them to local conditions with remarkable skill. What these structures reveal is not just technical ability, but a way of thinking that placed resilience at the center of urban life. The builders of the Basilica Cistern, the Tithe barn, the silos at Masada, and the Qanats of Iran were not trying to impress future tourists. They were trying to solve a problem as old as civilization itself: how to keep a community alive when nature or enemies turned against it. Their solutions were practical, durable, and often beautiful in their simplicity. And they still stand because they were built with an understanding of materials, climate, and human need that transcends any single era. Walking through these spaces today, you feel the weight of that knowledge. It is not a relic of a lost age. It is a reminder that the fundamental challenges of survival have not changed, even if the tools and the scale are different. The ingenuity of those builders is still speaking to us if we are willing to listen. The systems that fed medieval cities were far from primitive. They were the product of centuries of observation, trial, and refinement, shaped by the unique demands of climate, geography, and threat. Granaries raised on stone piers kept grain dry and cool while thieves and rodents struggled to reach the stores. Underground silos carved into bedrock or lined with clay turned the earth itself into a natural refrigerator, preserving wheat for years with no need for power or fuel. Cisterns, some as vast as underground lakes, captured every drop of winter rain and held it through the driest summer. Aqueducts carried water from distant springs over miles of open country, delivering a steady flow that made large cities possible in arid regions. Wells plunged deep into the water table, providing a backup that no surface blockage could touch. and the preservation techniques, the salting, smoking, drying, pickling, and fermenting, turned fresh harvests into stores that could outlast any siege or famine. Each solution was tailored to its local world. The stone vaults of Constantinople answered the long, dry summers of the Mediterranean. The timber barns of England rose high above damp ground to protect grain from relentless rain. The Qanats of Persia tunneled through rock to bring mountain water to desert cities. There was no single blueprint. There was only the shared challenge of keeping a community alive when the outside world could not be trusted to provide. In an age of global supply chains, where a city's food often travels thousands of miles before reaching a plate, the medieval emphasis on local storage resilience is worth understanding. Not because we should abandon modern convenience, but because redundancy and local capacity remain the quiet foundations of security. A system that depends on a single bridge, a single port, or a single harvest is only as strong as that one link. The medieval city knew that strength came from layers, from the household jar to the monastic barn to the municipal granary. That layered thinking still holds value today. So the next time you walk past a pantry, a cellar, or even a simple shelf of canned goods, consider the lineage of that idea. The impulse to store against the unknown is as old as civilization itself. And the people who built the Basilica Cistern and the Tithe barn at Great Coxwell understood it better than most. If you enjoyed this journey through the hidden systems that kept medieval cities alive, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with your thoughts on historical infrastructure. What storage systems do you rely on in your own life, and how prepared do you think your city is for the unexpected? The conversation continues below.